The AR-23C Liberator Concussive is the most staggering gun in Helldivers 2. Located on page 1 of the Steeled Veterans War Bond, this thing costs 20 medals in addition to the 1,000 super credits needed to unlock the War Bond itself. And although this gun is not one that you hear too much about, it is not to be overlooked. Dr. Pooplove here, and let's get right into it. Now, the Concussive is a part of the Liberator family of assault rifles, and as such, I will be offering some comparison to those guns in this video. But I also will be comparing this gun to some familiar favorites, such as the Scorcher, the Plasma Punisher, and the Jar, because the Concussive is also one of these guns that uses the word explosive. Although, as we will find, this gun just kind of confuses the picture even more. Now, the Concussive does 55 damage, which is typical of an assault rifle, operating just like its father, the AR-23 Liberator. But its capacity is 30, which is more like its brother, the AR-23P Liberator Penetrator, and both also have 10 mags. The Concussor does have a bit more recoil than both its family members, although significantly, its fire rate is exactly half of both. Now, the gun can be modded to be either fully automatic or semi-automatic, but I will say there is really no reason to ever put this thing in semi-automatic mode. And that's not because single firing this thing isn't valuable, isn't something you should do, because as I will discuss, you definitely should do that at times. But if you properly time your trigger pulls and pulse this weapon correctly, you can release the trigger to pull off single bullets at a time. Especially with the lower fire rate, it's just not that hard. And having that flexibility to fire in a single bullet fashion as well as holding down for full auto is just going to be a better option. Now, to be honest, with these stats, there isn't a ton to write home about. I mean, at first glance, these stats actually look worse than the OG Liberator, especially being at half the fire rate with less bullets per mag. But the inclusion of the explosive trait may make up for this, right? Well, not exactly. In a bizarre twist, despite having the explosive trait listed here, this does not operate in the same way as other guns that have the explosive trait, such as the Plasma Punisher and the Scorcher. You don't have this AoE effect that can actually end up killing yourself, or multiple enemies that are sitting next to each other can't splash damage the eggs, and you definitely cannot penetrate the heavy armor of enemies like the walkers or the bots with the shields. The Concussor actually operates more like the Jar in that this gun will deal explosive damage to enemies that have explosive weak spots, but you won't have these secondary explosions actually happening. And so it kind of turns out that the explosive trait that's listed on the Scorcher and the Plasma and the Concussive must not actually refer to what you would expect it to by having this word explosive listed. Rather, that effect must be one of the many infamous hidden traits that all guns apparently have according to the devs. And we just don't get to see what stat represents that actual explosion. Now, this may be undemocratic for me to say, but I do think we should have a little bit more transparency on what traits these guns have and what they actually mean. I do like a little bit of the mystique that the devs have been doing, where some things we just have to discover for ourselves. But we could have avoided this whole explosive confusion if the Scorcher and the Plasma Punisher had a different label than the Jar and the Concussive. So anyways, this explosive damage as part of the explosive trait is an advantage of this weapon for sure, but that is not really what makes this gun powerful. The main advantage of the Concussive is what is probably a hidden trait called Concussive, or basically the ability to stagger enemies. This thing can push back most things even as they are headed straight towards you. Now, versus the bots, this will come in handy versus anything that rushes you, especially enemies like the Berserker. And because of the stun, when you do get a hit on any shielded enemies, they swing their shield wildly, revealing all their weak spots. And versus the bots, the ability to pulse single fire this thing will come in handy as you end up playing a little bit more at range. But this also means you'll be doing a little bit more stunning than dealing that final kill blow. This gun is quite a bit more useful versus the bugs, because as the bugs constantly try to swarm you, you can stagger them. The small guys you can take out pretty easily without really needing to stagger them much, but the brood commanders that run straight at you are rendered stunned and stopped in their tracks, and so you can keep them at bay. And although the hive commanders have shields, you can shoot through the cracks and stun them too. You can also get stalkers who tend to rush at you, and hunters as well, but they are still regardless annoying to deal with. In general though, you will notice a big difference versus the more common enemies in the bug swarms. This is also pretty good against the bile spewers, as it does have that explosive damage we talked about, but also because the stagger will keep them at bay and even stop them from firing their bile at you. Now, unfortunately, this can't stagger the charger's main charge, but the explosive damage does do extra damage to that butt. However, I will say that even that extra damage feels like forever and not substantially amazingly effective. I think it would be cool if you could stagger or slow the chargers with some head-on shots that maybe just don't do damage, and that would actually make me pick up this gun more, but they like to keep the chargers strong. Also, versus the new Shriekers, it doesn't actually stagger these guys as they are doing their dives straight at you, and I really wish that it could. In general though, versus the majority of the bugs, this is a good pick. And one pro tip I have is to pulse fire individual targets to hold them back and really take your time being surgical with this gun to save up your ammo and just keep the general horde back. Not worrying too much about getting the final kills, but just keeping them at bay. And I only really go for full auto when they begin to really surround you and overwhelm you. Also, you can use the stuns to kind of try to corral the enemies together into one spot and then use another weapon to really take them out. All in all, this one ability of staggering can be quite useful at protecting yourself from the onslaught of especially bugs. And for that reason, this is a good weapon to consider taking with you on the battlefield. It's certainly not the best, but I did notice that dealing with the bugs was a little less annoying because of that ability to just keep them away from me. But what tips do you have? Let me know in the comments, and thank you to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.